Welcome to A Place for Film, the I Used to Know podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about the fall 2013 Midnight Movie Series. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And on this week's episode, we're talking about the Midnight Movie Series, programmed every year by grad students in the Communication and Culture section, graduate department. And with us this week to talk about it is David Church.
Hello.
Sean Smalley.
Hi.
And the wild card, Will Scheibel.
Hello.
Will's been on the show many times, and David and Sean have as well. But Will, you're not usually here for this series.
No, they pulled me out of my classical Hollywood hole and into the realm of exploitation. So,
excellent. Well, we will be excited to hear about that a little bit later. Okay, well, let's do it. Let's talk about the Midnight series. The Midnight series is always one of the most fun series to talk about because it's always totally bonkers, and I love that. I love that we live in a place that can show films like this with no sense of irony. Just like, yes, this is an important film. We're going to show it. So tell us just a little bit about the Midnight series. What is it encompassing and what sorts of films? I mean, other than the fact that they will play at midnight, why are they playing at midnight? What is it about this series that makes it worth the cinema's scheduling time?
Historically speaking, midnight movies have been used to show films that have been sort of acquired a cult reputation. They're often seen as films that were too offbeat to program at other hours of the day, and so that the tradition of showing films at midnight and getting a sort of cultish audience out there for them, for these sort of niche interest films, that's something that we're sort of drawing upon here. Although the downside of that maybe is that, showing them at midnight, you may not necessarily get quite as broad of an audience as some of these films might deserve, in their own right. So there's sort of a plus side and a downside to that as well. If people are coming out to see a movie at midnight and the movie gets over at 2:00, they're not going to want to stick around at 2 or 3 in the morning for a Q&A afterwards or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's pluses and minuses to it, but this season what we wanted to do is we wanted to have sort of a specific theme, and so we went with more human than human for our theme this year. Initially, we were going to show Blade Runner, which is, of course, where that famous line is from, but the rights weren't available to it. So we'd already formed together this nice body of films that we thought, oh, yeah, more human than human, and then realized, well, let's just...
The centerpiece wasn't available.
Let's just go with it anyway.
But that's how we kind of came about it. We just got together and threw together about 20 titles, and at the 20th title, I realized, hey, we have a theme here. Because the way we did it last year is we just got together and picked a film we really cared about, and that was going to be the series. But now I thought, well, maybe we should try something a little different instead of just throwing together these random films. Let's find a common thread, and we didn't want to pick something that was so specific that it would bore the audiences. We didn't want to do a midnight series of zombie films or something like that, because that would get tedious after 2 films.
Sure.
But
it's already tedious. Zombie films.
Yeah. So we wanted to do something that kind of linked the films together, but was still broad enough to encompass many different subgenres, films from different countries, different styles, and I think we were able to pull it off with this list.
Yeah, I think so. I'm always excited when I don't recognize most of the films. Now, unfortunately, I do recognize 4 of these films, so you failed. No, I'm just kidding.
But that's the thing about midnight movies, too, is that they're not necessarily obscure movies.
Exactly.
I mean, a lot of studio films that, were considered flops or didn't quite find an audience that found an audience later, those would certainly be considered midnight movies. And, a lot of the 70s genre stuff that came out, which is when midnight movies were really big. The studio stuff that was coming out was still pretty crazy compared to what's coming out today.
Well, sometimes they're repurposed, right? Like the film Mommy Dearest, which is a biopic of Joan Crawford. I always assumed that was meant to be a kind of campy homage to this camp icon, but apparently Paramount intended it to be very earnest, and it got panned by critics, and audiences weren't taking it seriously, so they repurposed it as this sort of black comedy and encouraged people to come with props like wire hangers and stuff. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
So. I think the same could be said about pretty much all of Paul Verhoeven's work in Hollywood.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I also want to point out that this doesn't always necessarily have to be an old film. You guys have shown some stuff that's very recent. You aren't doing it this year, but last year I remember you showed like Beyond the Black Rainbow, which had just come out and stuff like that. So, yeah, so it's not always really old stuff. Although I'm always more excited when it's old, obscure stuff. But you've earned it with this first one here. So let's talk about this first film, Lady Terminator.
Well, I first saw Lady Terminator in Chicago last summer. Some guys from the Alamo Drafthouse were doing a traveling grindhouse series. They were making a stop in Chicago, and it just coincided with my trip back to Wisconsin to visit family. And I spent a night in Chicago, and I've been dying to see this film for at least a year. And I finally got to see it on 35 millimeter, and the print that they had looked really good. So I'm hoping that's the print that we get.
Yeah.
But it was worth the wait. I had seen nothing quite like it. I think a lot of film fans don't really know much about the exploitation industry and the exploitation film industry in Indonesia, but they had a really big boom in the 70s and 80s, and Lady Terminator is kind of one of the absolute gems. Actually, the director, I don't know how to say his full name, but Jalil, made some of the craziest films within that market. Some of his other films that other people might know about there's one called Mystics in Bali, which plays on a kind of common trope in Indonesian horror films of the flying head. There's a great moment in Mystics in Bali where the lead character, who is under the control of this witch, is her head. I think it's all shot in green screen, but her head comes up and you see her spine, and she just flies through the air, flies into some house, and does something I probably can't say on public radio to a pregnant woman. But I mean, he's known for making these really bizarre genre films. Typically, the Indonesian exploitation movies from that period, they were really into women in prison films.
Wasn't that like one of the destinations for Roger Corman? Didn't he figure out he could make movies really cheap in that part of the world?
He went to the Philippines.
Okay.
But there's a lot of similarity between the two industries. They kind of wandered into that territory at the same time. Corman made a lot of movies out there, women in prison films, these kind of films with revolutionary themes, guerrillas, stuff like that. So they did some of that in Indonesia, but their prime export was kind of fantasy horror films. They played a lot with their own mythology that was brought into a lot of these films and then updated with typically Western action films or horror films. And the director of Lady Terminator, this isn't the first time that he made a film that is directly riffing on a American hit, which, as you guess from the title, it's basically Terminator with a female character.
Was it always intended to be that, or is this one of those films that they retitled later on, hoping
it was
to cash
retitled
in?
like that?
Yeah,
I think
okay.
the original translated title is something like The Revenge of the South Sea Queen.
Okay.
But they retitled it to kind of make money off of that. But he made a film shortly after Nightmare on Elm Street came out called Satan's Bed, which it's very entertaining. It takes the basic elements from Nightmare on Elm Street and makes it crazier. There's I think there's a shot of a claw or the knife glove coming out of the bathtub and the woman's legs. But in this character, the Freddy Krueger character, or this movie, the Freddy Krueger character has a sidekick that's a succubus. And they can, of course, being an Indonesian film, they can cut their heads off and the heads fly around and chase people. So I would really recommend if you can find Indonesian films from that period, check them out. They're really crazy, especially by this director. But back to Lady Terminator, it's a wonderful blend of that kind of Eastern style, the Indonesian style, using mysticism and folk mythology. But the action scenes, I mean, I think people might laugh this film off, but it's really, given the budget that they're working with, and I think it's actually a really engaging, interesting film. It's a lot of fun.
It's hilariously bad, and yet it holds up.
It holds up. There's still something more there. The performances are pretty off the wall. Especially the lead, the person who plays Lady Terminator is great. Her expressions are hilarious. It's a film that you got to really suck in every little detail. Every little gesture is sublime.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so that one's on September 13th, Friday the 13th at 11:59 p.m. Notice all of these are going to be listed at 11:59, so you know it's going to be starts 11:59 and then so it's that day and then be there at 11:59. So the next one listed here is one of my favorite movies of all time. In fact, this is probably my top 5 favorite movies of all time. John,
I was going to say, I heard you cut a trailer for.
Yes, I did. I cut a trailer for this. I don't know if you might see it in the cinema. I don't know if it's been shown in the cinema yet. But John told me he was going to get it set up so it can be played at the cinema. But I did cut a trailer for this film, John Carpenter's The Thing, from 1982. I honestly think this is Carpenter's masterpiece. I think for sure, better than Halloween, better than anything else he's ever done. And what really strikes me about this film is the creature effects. Mm-hmm. I've never seen anything like the creature effects in this movie. It's so creative. It's so out there. But tell me your guys' perspective.
Well, there's actually 4 of us that program this. The kind of mystery man that is not here is Joshua Vasquez, and I think this was his pick.
Yeah.
We all love the movie, though. I would say. So that was sort of once he proposed that, we didn't need much convincing to have that on the docket. But it's a remake of a Howard Hawks film. Well, Howard Hawks produced the film, although no one ever can remember the name of the director.
I think it's Christian Nyby.
I can't remember.
Christian Nyby. But I from what I've heard, Hawks ghost directed quite a bit of it.
Well, that makes sense because it might as well be directed by Howard Hawks.
Yeah.
So, and this is one of those rare occurrences where the remake is as good as the original, if not better. And I know that might be sacrilegious for some people. The original Thing, the full title being The Thing from Another World, is one of the great 1950s Hollywood sci-fi films. And this, I think, is one of the great American sci-fi horror films of the 80s. And you guys probably know more about this than I do, since this, horror is something you guys work on closely. But it sort of kind of came out at a time when a lot of sci-fi horror films were dealing with bodily transformations and kind of, the Fly and Alien, and I think this is, even among those films, one of the kind of crown jewels.
Yeah, and it was actually when it came out. It's funny because we're also showing E.T., which is the film that John Carpenter thought, killed the Thing at the box office. So, but when it came out, it was kind of considered a flop. It wasn't very well received by the critics, but it has since then become a very big cult hit. And as you said, it's up there with one of John Carpenter's best films. And I think the special effects still hold up really well today.
Yeah. Well, they hold up because they're practical makeup effects.
Yeah.
There wasn't, they really worked hard on it, you can tell. It's an exceptionally gory film, but you'll see gore like you've never seen gore before. It's so creative the way they do it. And the atmosphere.
Yeah, I like
so
the way
tense.
I like the way that he kind of blends that. I mean, you have those moments of extravagant transformation scenes, and but it's also very kind of sparse and minimalist in many ways too. It's very methodical. It takes its time to get going. There's a lot that isn't said in the film too. You just kind of have to infer it.
Yep.
It's a very complicated film too. I mean, there are just so many things that you have to be really paying attention to catch on. So many subtle details.
Yep.
That Carpenter really crafted this well.
Yeah.
I mean, he handled the small stuff really well, and then the freak out scenes really well too.
Yeah. Stars Kurt Russell. Keith David is also in this, and Wilford Brimley,
Yep.
the oatmeal and diabetes guy.
Diabetes.
He is in this film, and he's amazing in this film.
Check your thing and check it often.
If you thought he was just a commercial pitch man, watch this film.
Yeah.
You will see.
And
he
it's
is not.
got to be one of Kurt Russell's best performances.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, he had a long relationship with John Carpenter,
Yeah.
clearly. He was in Escape from New York and Escape from L.A. And
Big Trouble in Little China,
yes,
which
of
is
course.
awesome.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe this... maybe Big Trouble in Little China might be a little bit, at least on the same level as this one for me, but still. Anything else you want to say about The Thing?
No, it's extraordinarily suspenseful. It's not just a gory movie. It really does build tension in a way that I think few other horror movies do.
Yeah.
And
so successfully.
and the ending is just
Yeah.
great too. It's just so
Yeah.
apocalyptic and
Yeah.
And in that sense, it also sort of touches on the fringes of some interesting philosophical ideas. That
absolutely.
I think that it doesn't get as much credit for that because the gore makeup is so spectacular. And I think the monster effects are among the best I've seen in any movie then or now. But I also think that the ideas in the film are not something to take lightly either. It's interesting that 1982 was the year of two famous sci-fi flops, this film and Blade Runner. And I think now few would dispute their place in,
absolutely.
the classics of the genre. But so we can't get Blade Runner, we get the next best thing.
Yeah.
thing.
Well, I mean that what you just said was really interesting to me because the film almost asks the question like, what does it mean to be a human?
Exactly.
Who are you? You are this grouping of cells, but what does that mean about who you are and that sort of thing? It's very, very interesting. I never thought about it that way.
It's also curious that it came out in '82, which is right around the time the AIDS crisis is first coming to public attention. And this is probably, at least I haven't heard that this was something on the filmmakers' radar in terms of something they were intentionally getting at. But the idea of all these men sort of secluded on this base and trying to figure out who can you trust, who is infected, who's not. And then
There's something wrong with my blood. What is
the
it?
famous scene with having to test your blood to see if it's going to fly
Yeah.
out of the petri dish.
Wow, you just blew my mind, David.
It has some interesting, if merely coincidental
Yeah.
resonances.
and add to the fact that you never see the scenes where the people get contaminated too. I mean,
Yeah.
that's always kept off the camera. So
Yeah. Wow. Whole new dimensions. That's why I like inviting smarter people than me on the show. Okay, so that one's October 4th, Friday at 11:59 p.m. The next film, you did get one zombie film in here, though I don't know if this is a real sort of zombie film or if it's just titled Zombie.
It's
I
real-
see-
it's a
real
zombie film.
zombies,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, because I see a dude here with a picture with like lasers coming out of his eyes.
That's actually
That's
Lady
Lady
Terminator.
Oh, okay. That's Lady Terminator. All right. So Zombie is the next film. Tell me about this one.
Well, this is a film that was technically a rip-off of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Dawn of the Dead came out in 1978. It was a American and Italian co-production. So you had Dario Argento and Claudio Argento, brothers who are associated with the Italian horror industry. They co-produced this with George Romero. Meanwhile, the film Dawn of the Dead comes out in Italy just titled Zombie. Makes a lot of money. And so this other guy, this competitor to Argento, named Lucio Fulci, who had been building a career as a horror filmmaker, he comes along and says, well, we're going to make an unofficial sequel called Zombie 2. Although here we're using the title, it was reintroduced to America as just Zombie. It's gone under a lot of different names over the course of its life. But it's, even though it's trying to be sort of a rip-off in name only of Romero's film, I think it's a very different type of movie where George Romero tends to use zombies as social metaphors for things like, in Dawn of the Dead, it's linking zombies with consumerism, in the shopping mall and everything like that. Fulci really doesn't care that much about that sort of thing. He really just wants to make an extremely visceral and exciting and exploitative zombie movie. And so he sort of traces the zombie back to its roots in Haitian mythology and voodoo by setting this in the Caribbean instead of in the U.S. like he did with his other zombie films like Night of the Living Dead and so on. And it's an extraordinarily gory movie. It's a cheesy movie in a number of ways, but it's probably one of the most memorable zombie movies you'll see. I think it's a classic of the genre. Personally, I think I like it better than any of Romero's films. It may not be as historically notable or important, but I think as a zombie movie, just on that level, it's maybe one of the best.
Yeah. Now, I never heard of Lucio Fulci. Is he known for anything else?
He was mostly a horror specialist, but he worked in a number of different genres in the Italian exploitation industry from the 1950s on up until the early 90s when he died.
Yeah, I think he's most known for the horror films because those are the films that really got exported from Italy. So, when you say Lucio Fulci, people think of Zombie, they think of The Beyond, City of the Living Dead, House by the Cemetery. But he's made spaghetti westerns, he made sex comedies, he made sword and sandal epics. He kind of followed trends where they went, and he just happened to, I think a lot of his career rests on the fact that when he jumped onto the zombie and cannibal trend in Italy in the late 70s, he made the best of those films.
Yeah.
And probably the goriest of them, too.
Yeah. So he's really associated with the best of the best when it comes to Italian zombie movies, which, if you're a fan of zombie movies, they're sort of upheld as some of the most distinctive ones.
Yeah. Well, I generally, I'm so tired of zombies, but I'll be happy to watch an old zombie movie because I want to see where, the older stuff. The newer stuff is, I'm very tired of the zombies. But anyways, that one is October 25th, Friday at 11:59 p.m. The next one, I don't think we've had hardcore porn at the cinema for a while.
Not for a while.
Not for a while. Not since Stewardesses. That wasn't full.
No, that was softcore.
That was softcore.
Cafe Flesh.
Cafe Flesh.
Cafe
And this is also actually, I guess, The Devil and Miss Jones returning to IU because there is a past of screening these films back in the 70s.
Okay.
I've been doing some research. I wrote an article for The Writer about these screenings of hardcore films back in the late 70s into early 80s that were kind of effectively banned around 85, I believe. But yeah, they were put on by the dorms. They were used as fundraisers.
Oh, wow.
Deep Throat was the big draw in every September, but they would do this regularly, and the student groups would use this for, intramural sports or sponsoring a team at Little Five or buying equipment for the rec room in the dorm. It was a big deal, but it was eventually shut down. And but this was a film that.
So you said the title, but I want to make sure we don't miss it, just in case somebody didn't realize what the title was. The Devil in Miss Jones. So this is a woman kills herself, and then she didn't live the sexual life she wanted to. So she makes a deal that she can go back and have all the sex she never had while she was alive, and that's sort of the whole. That's it. Like that's the opening, and then it just goes from there. But tell me more about it. Tell me more about it. How did it compare? I mean, like. I see that it came out a year after Deep Throat, but how did it compare to that one?
Well, it's by the same filmmaker, Gerard Damiano, and it was made, though, on a larger budget and received better critical notices than Deep Throat did. It's also, generically speaking, even though they're both hardcore films, it's a much more serious and somber film. In fact, in many ways, the sex in it isn't necessarily as erotic as you might think that it could be, even though it is very explicit. And let me make no bones about that. But the whole premise of what's going on in the film, it's been compared to, and in fact, it was deliberately being ripped off from Jean-Paul Sartre's play No Exit. So there is a sort of existential crisis going on here in terms of someone who commits suicide ends up in this limbo state, and then what happens to them when they're there. So it's a more thoughtful film, I think, than what you might think coming into it just based on the description itself. And I think that's one of the reasons why it is upheld today as one of sort of the masterpieces of that early to mid-'70s boom when it was a novel thing to be able to see these films in the theater. I think the experience of being able to see one of these 70s so-called porno chic films in the theater with a group of people is a very different experience than the way that people typically see pornographic material today, at home on video or the computer or whatever it might be. I mean, it's seeing these sorts of things going on a big screen, among a group of people. It is quite a different experience. And so it's to put yourself into that sort of historical reception context in some way, I think is sort of a treat for us.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind that, around the time that Deep Throat came out, Damiano said, I want to make these kinds of films, but with bigger budgets, more Hollywood-style production values. And he had this dream that, by the mid to end 70s, Hollywood would start making these kind of films. And you can kind of see in the porno chic era some big filmmakers in certain areas, like Radley Metzger, for example, made some films that sometimes blur the line between art house and the porn theaters. His films like The Opening of Misty Beethoven and Barbara Broadcast are very stylish, well scripted, well shot films with good performances, something most people wouldn't expect. But there was that brief moment before the backlash that people thought maybe we would get a different kind of pornographic film. And this is a good example of what kind of came out of that discussion from Deep Throat.
Cool. That one is Friday, November 8th at 11:59 p.m. So this next one is one that I've never heard of. So this is the one that...
And that's a shame because it's a wonderful film. I would rank this among my favorite films of all time. Possession is...
Yes, Possession.
Andrzej Żuławski is a very, very unique director. I mean, he's one of the few auteurs that really has a style of his own, that there's just no one making films like him. Something like a Herzog or something. I mean, the camera work is always exquisite. The performances are always manic and hysterical. This film is probably his most famous one. It won some awards at Cannes the year it came out. I think Isabella Gianni got the Best Actress award for this film. But it's kind of a family psychodrama mixed with a body horror film. It starts out subtle. I mean, I guess as subtle as Żuławski can get. I mean, his films are often very melodramatic and excessive, but this starts out kind of showing the breakdown of a marriage, and it's finally shown that Isabella Gianni's character is having an affair with her estranged husband, and he wants to know with who, and he finds out, and then the lover finds out that she's cheating on him with something, and it turns out not to be human, and it just goes off the rails from there. Doppelgangers abound. It's one of a kind. It's something I think everyone should check out. It's
one of these movies that it's a shame that we're almost a shame we're showing it at midnight, because it does really deserve a bigger audience, and it's a film that is extremely well made and very thoughtful, very dense. There's a lot going on in it on various political levels. It's sort of a political allegory for the Cold War. The whole thing takes place in West Berlin, within literal sight of the Berlin Wall, and so that's something that's going on there. And you have a lot going on under the surface of this movie. But it's really a pretty extraordinary, one of a kind film. I think anybody who likes art films, anyone who likes horror films, anyone who likes David Cronenberg films or Roman Polanski, those are some people who you might sort of compare it to, but it is really sort of its own thing.
That's how I was going to ask if it was comparable to like Altered States, stuff like that, because that they've shown that sort of during the afternoon at the cinema and stuff, which was a treat, I thought. So,
I mean, up until Possession, I would consider Possession a horror film, but up until that point, Żuławski had been a figure within the art house scene, the festival circuit, but this is probably the first film that was received as kind of a cross between the art house and genre films in his work. But after this, he made a couple of films in the 80s in France, because I think he was actually kicked out of Poland, not for explicitly political reasons, but because his films were just so bizarre that the authorities didn't know what to do with it. They thought he was corrupting the nation, so they heavily censored his work. But he hasn't. He went back to Poland in the mid '90s after the fall of communism, and he made a film in '96. I think he made something in '99, and he hasn't really done anything since then.
Wow.
So it's kind of sad that he's fallen through the cracks, because he's really a great filmmaker. And
this is a fairly new 35 millimeter print as well. Because, there was a retrospective of some of his work within the last year, and so this is going to be a really good looking and sounding print, which is great because it's a good looking and good sounding picture.
Excellent.
Yeah. Well, one of the cool things about having a movie like Possession on there, and I think there's an argument that you can make for just about all of these films doing this, but I think maybe Possession most explicitly is that it really kind of dissolves that artificial boundary between so-called high and low culture. So, your description, one of you guys wrote the description for this, right? I mean, it could have been the description for like a Bergman film minus the inhuman affair. But, so on one hand, it is this kind of art film, family melodrama, but on the other hand, it's also this kind of sci-fi horror film as well. And that, there's this kind of unfair assumption that midnight films are just things to be laughed at or kind of schlock factor. And I mean, as much as we can, laugh at something like Lady Terminator, there's also, as you guys were saying, these things you can latch on and take very earnestly. And I think this is probably the most explicit example of a film that seems to make, overt claims to artistic integrity while working in these so-called low conventions of horror and science fiction and pulp, things like that. So,
yeah. All right, so Possession is November 22nd. That's a Friday at 11:59 p.m. The final one of the series is one that I hold close to my heart as well, Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. I did not know that this movie existed until probably 10 years after it was released. And as soon as I saw that it existed, I knew I had to see it as soon as possible. And this one was hard to find for a long time on any sort of after, home video market. But I finally got a look at it, and it is a really interesting film. So tell me, what do you think about it?
This was my pick. I think it's one of David Lynch's best films, and I know that might be a kind of polemical statement. So I'm not trying to be a provocateur by saying that. I really do think that it is.
Oh, admit it. You are.
Okay, it's both. I'm enjoying being a provocateur by having this on here instead of Eraserhead or something like that. But I really do think that it's a criminally underrated film, and. If you look at the history of midnight movies, Eraserhead, which was 1970, 77, same year as Star Wars. Yeah, that's one of the I guess maybe canonical midnight films. David Lynch's Eraserhead, and I don't know that this film, Fire Walk with Me, has that same sort of reputation. But instead of having Eraserhead, which is sort of generally regarded as one of, if not David Lynch's masterpiece, I wanted to pick something that seems to have some of the same elements, but has been kind of neglected in both scholarship on David Lynch and also just his own kind of following. In the description, I don't know how many people will have read the description by the time the episode airs, but I mentioned that it was booed at the Cannes Film Festival and was really disparaged by critics. And one of the worst things that was said about this movie, Vincent Canby in the New York Times said, "It's not the worst movie ever made, but it just seems like it's the worst movie ever made." I don't really know what he's talking about. I think it's great, and I think that if you love the show Twin Peaks, which was this very short-lived but at the time phenomenally popular kind of murder mystery sitcom / horror show.
Soap opera.
Yeah, exactly. This is sort of hybrid show that ran from 1990 to 1991. If you like that show, I think that all of the intrigue that show had is here in the film, but it's a much less overtly lovable text. The show emphasized more of the kind of quirky humor of the characters and the sort of soap opera-like relationships, whereas the movie really plays up more of the horror angle. The show absolutely has that horror stuff, but it's a little more secondary in a lot of the episodes.
Well, the show really sort of plays up Laura Palmer as like this horrible victim and these terrible things that happen to her. The movie kind of turns her around a little bit. It's like, no, this is who she was, and
yeah, it's kind of a character study in a way. She's the object of mystery in the show. The first episode is when the town discovers that their beloved homecoming queen, Laura Palmer, has been murdered. And then there's this investigator that's called in, played by Kyle MacLachlan, to solve the crime. And that crime becomes more and more complicated the more he investigates it, and completely otherworldly. There are some really surreal turns that the show takes. And the movie is the 7 days leading up to her murder. So she's the main character of the movie instead of the sort of structuring absence of the series. So it's very much a kind of character study, but it's also still drawing from the same mythology of the show. And I think the reason that people hated the movie so much is they were looking for answers. And the show leaves open all these mysteries. And it is truly unlike anything else I've ever seen on television. I don't watch much television, but it's not like anything I've seen even in movies. And those questions are not really answered by this film. The film just sort of makes those questions even more ambiguous. And I tend to kind of like that. But I do think that thematically and emotionally there is a kind of resolution in the film. And so not only does it not answer any of the questions, but it's much, much darker than the show. And I think people were totally put off by that.
It seems like it's more concentrated, as if you took the season of the show and kind of squeezed it. What was left was sort of the dark elements.
Yeah, exactly.
And I would say that a lot of TV shows have tried to sort of mimic the formula or just sort of, we've got all these weird characters and these weird things going on. But everyone wants answers, like Lost. I immediately think of Lost. Like everyone's like, "Give me this answer now," and it's like I feel like perhaps they were, like they had to give a reasoning, and they just came up with this one that a lot of people weren't satisfied with. Whereas Twin Peaks kind of just ended, and people don't
it was
like
canceled.
because it was canceled. But people didn't, obviously people didn't like that. But at the same time, it was probably a good thing that they didn't just sort of force Lynch to come up with some sort of like reasoning for everything happening.
I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, I tend to not like. One of the reasons I don't get involved in a lot of TV dramas is I tend to not like really sort of plot-driven sorts of narratives. But as convoluted as the narrative of Twin Peaks is, it's also one of the creepiest shows, and this film I think is one of the creepiest movies I've ever seen, and just sort of evoking a style and a tone that is totally unique. I think that this movie is very much in the spirit of the show in that way. I don't think it's being disingenuous. I think the episodes of the show that are really creepy are extended and explored even further by the kind of tone and the style of this film. But at the same time, it still sort of narratively plugs into certain aspects of the show as well.
Yeah, I always found the show weird just because most of the weird stuff happens like during the day.
Yeah.
The
everyday surrealism.
Yeah, they're not trying to like, it's dark outside now that weird stuff happens. No, it's like weird stuff is happening all the time, and it's usually when the sun is up.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
So I think it's unique in that manner. It's just sort of like, this could happen any day of the week to anybody.
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of a fun sort of draw.
Yeah,
at least I did to the show.
No, I would completely agree with that. It takes a sort of everyday genre like the soap opera, where the day-to-day activities of people having affairs and so forth, and then sort of takes it down the rabbit hole. And just when you think you know where you are in this world, there are backwards talking dwarfs and giants and red rooms that appear in the woods and owls that are not what they seem and evil spirits and then it's also this kind of murder mystery and this kind of UFO show. I think it's amazing.
It is definitely amazing.
Yeah.
I would recommend that you watch up to the point when you find out who killed Laura Palmer. Watch to there, and then just make a decision at that point if you're going to watch the rest of it, because it goes off on a tangent. I think David Lynch left at a certain point or didn't have enough of it plotted, and some other people took over, and it gets weird, but in a different way. It turns into almost like a Junior Sleuth show for a while there, and it comes back around. Actually.
It does, yeah.
Like stick with it until you see David Duchovny in a dress, and then if you're not with it once you see David Duchovny in a dress, then just turn it off because you're never going to come back.
If you're not with it,
come back to the last episode though.
That's
the
true.
very last episode.
I love the last episode.
Well, that's what I'm saying. David Duchovny sort of leads up to that. If you can get to the point where you see David Duchovny in a dress,
Keep going.
then you're good. The rest of it is really good.
And if you're not with it after the pilot, there's no hope for you with the film.
Exactly.
You'll either love it or hate it.
Yeah, definitely. We talked about Twin Peaks a lot when we were doing our episode on television shows over the summer. And that's definitely something I hold close to my heart.
Yeah,
I love
me
that
too.
show. Okay, so that one's December 6th. That's a Friday, again at 11:59 p.m. Any other thoughts about the series, guys?
Well, there's one more film that we wanted to
Oh, okay.
briefly discuss too. David, you want to say some stuff about Orgy at Lil's Place?
Oh yeah, Orgy at Lil's Place is one that it's not technically part of the Midnight series. It's associated with the Orphan Symposium.
Yeah.
But it is playing at midnight, so we thought we would throw it a bone here. It's a film that the Kinsey Institute recently rediscovered a print of. It was long considered lost, and we found a print, one or two 35 millimeter prints of it, and I'm still not sure what shape they're in exactly.
From what I heard, pretty rough, but sometimes that's good for a midnight screening. That's kind of part of the appeal, is to see a really beat up print.
Yeah.
And it's for those of us who study exploitation films or adult films or things like that, it's a pretty significant find in that it's sort of a lost or missing link in the history of sexploitation films, which came out roughly around 1959, 1960, and started to really exploit the new released censorship restrictions on nudity and simulated sex. And so this particular film was one of the big hits to come out of the New York sexploitation filmmaking scene. There were basically two big places, LA and New York, where these films were being made on very low budgets. And this one was produced by this pretty prolific exploitation film distributor named William Mishkin, who also distributed a lot of the Andy Milligan films, produced and distributed those. Yep. So he'll come up when Nicholas Winding Refn is here, I think. But Orgy at Lil's Place is, and I haven't seen it, no one has really seen it in decades, it's probably R-rated by today's standards. In fact, it was resubmitted to the MPAA and got an R rating in like 1972 or so. It's probably pretty mild by today's standards, certainly nowhere near something like Devil and Miss Jones, since so much had changed in terms of censorship over that 10-year period. But we're talking about a 50-year-old film here from 1963, really about sort of what happens when you start to follow the sexual counterculture that's opening up in the 60s. And this idea that, the 60s, you have a lot more avenues for sexual expression opening up, and sexploitation films were really sort of about that. They're really about, what happens when someone is not necessarily responsible in terms of going down the rabbit hole into these different areas of sexual exploration. So oftentimes there will be women who are going out into the world and exploring their own sexuality, but at the same time get caught up in these various dastardly schemes and so on. And so they're ideologically and politically very problematic in terms of how they're sort of saying, well, here are these new things that are opening up, but women, let's not have you really sort of follow these things. Mm-hmm. So they're upholding a double standard in a lot of ways. But they're really interesting films nevertheless, because they really are about how not only people at that time were really sort of starting to open up and explore these new sexual avenues, but the movies themselves were doing that. Mm-hmm. And so you have this interesting sort of tension between what's shown on the screen and what the screen itself can show. And Orgy at Lil's Place was a big hit, really helped to make a boom in the New York sexploitation industry. It was an early example of what's called a roughie, which is usually a sexploitation variant where you have some sort of rape or coercion or something like that happens as one of the major sort of story themes or story elements. And that was different than the earlier sexploitation films, which were called nudie cuties, where you really didn't have any sort of physical contact between people. They were just sort of innocent people, wandering around nudist camps and playing nude volleyball and things like that. They were pretty innocuous. But these roughies started to get, as the name implies, rougher, and started to use violent forms of physical contact as sort of a substitute for what you couldn't show sexually. So they sort of eroticize violence in very sort of problematic ways. But at the same time, they're interesting in terms of how, as like Will said earlier, you saw a lot of things happening in like the art film industry around the same time with films like, Bergman's The Virgin Spring or De Sica's Two Women, were also films, exploiting these sorts of scenes of rape or whatever it might be in very sort of visceral ways that really hadn't been seen on screens, especially American screens at that time. So it was this really interesting moment in terms of art films and exploitation films like Orgy at Lil's Place and a lot of other things just kind of coming together on the same cinema screens. And so being able to go back and find a lost film like Orgy at Lil's Place and sort of put it back into the historical context that it deserves, and to try to see, okay, where did it come from? How is that a bridge to these later films that then became extremely numerous and much more provocative? I think it'll be a great opportunity for people to see this film that you're not going to be able to see anywhere else.
Yeah. Very cool. So that is Orgy at Lil's Place, September 27th at 11:59. That's also a Friday. So, yeah. Well, this is a great series, guys. I'm really excited to see a lot of these. I hope that I can stay up till midnight for at least a couple of these. I didn't make it to any the last year. I'm sorry about that. I intended to go to most of them, and then it was just like 11:30, and I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I was hoping I'd see you at Cruising. I saw you before as you were leaving, but I was hoping you'd.
I was there for the film before Cruising, but I didn't stay for Cruising.
That's the good thing about the Midnight series is that if you can make it there, you're going to most likely stay awake during the movie. There's going to be something in the movie that either shocks you awake or keeps you looking at the screen to see what happens next.
Yeah. Although I do remember some people grumbling as they walked out of the cinema after the Herzog film that we showed at midnight because they thought it was so slow.
That's true.
Nosferatu.
Yeah, which I think it's a great film.
Yeah.
But we are going to do something a little bit special. We did this before Cruising, and John and I thought it worked really well. So we're gonna. I don't want to say what it is. It's a little bit of a surprise, but we're doing something a little special before the midnight movies that we're showing on film.
Okay.
And they're all going to be on 35 millimeter, except for The Thing, which is a 2K DCP.
Nice.
Very cool. Very cool. Any other final thoughts before we get out of here, guys?
I'll just maybe point to some other films that people who might be interested in the Midnight series. Sure. There's a great series that was curated by Joan Hawkins and Josh Vasquez. Joan is teaching a class in horror film, so if you like the stuff that we're showing, there are 2 more Italian horror films that are playing at the cinema this semester. There's Black Sunday, the Mario Bava film, a great gothic horror film from 1960. And Dario Argento's Suspiria, which is another wonderful supernatural horror film, wild with color and music and style. It's a film you definitely do not want to miss on the big screen if you have a free Wednesday night in October. And it was, I think you talked about it with the Underground people, but The Telephone Book is another film that anyone interested in cult cinema or sexploitation or the New York Underground, that's a film to see. It's really great.
Cool. Well, I'm really excited about this, guys. Again, I hope that I'll be talking about these all throughout the semester because I really want to go, but we'll see how late I can stay up. So anyways, Will, Sean, and David. Sorry, I was about to say David, and I knew no. Will, Sean, and David. Thank you guys.
I get them confused myself.
Yeah. Thank you guys very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you for programming such an interesting series. I'm sure John appreciates that. But we'll get out of here. So thank you guys very much for listening and watching. My name is Andy.
And I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.